Okay. Hello, welcome back from lunch. And thank you for coming to our workshop number 4, the Care Infrastructure, Measuring Gaps and Identifying Funding Sources. So before we start, I've been asked to read a couple of announcements. So please remember to share and tweet on social media using hashtags CARE Conference with 2 capital C's at IWPR eSearch, just 1 R in there, and at AU_PGAE, all caps. Also, when you get your chance to ask questions a little later, then please remember to use the microphone so people online can hear you, and also to give your name and your organization. Okay, so without further ado, so I should introduce myself. So I'm Mika Muirs. I'm professor of economics here at American University, and I'm the moderator for this session. And our first speaker will be Sanya Jalani, who will be presenting. She's a research consultant at IWPR, and she will be presenting slides, please. Whoops. Measuring the care infrastructure, a state-level indicator.
Thank you, Mika. My name is Sanya. As she mentioned, I am a fourth-year PhD student, as well as a research consultant for IWPR. So I'm going to be talking about a state-level indicator that Martha and I worked on as part of the Salesforce project for the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And in terms of the project objective and the motivation, the main point that we want to emphasize here is that we've developed a state-level indicator using both the demand for care and the supply of care work. So that in itself allows us to have an idea, as we'll see from the indicator, what is happening with respect to the paid supply side. And it wouldn't be fair if I didn't give credit to the sort of methodology that we're adapting. So Martha was part of a paper that was looking at the same idea in Colombia. And the methodology that we're focusing on is primarily borrowed from that original paper. So within that paper, the way that we define care infrastructure is essentially a relationship between the number of full-time care workers that are available and the people who need care. So it allows us to have a broader understanding of not just full-time workers for care work, but also those who are supplying at least some part of their work hours for care and what that would look like if it was translated into full-time equivalent. And before I go forward with the data sources, I kind of want to mention that this is our initial work for the US economy. And we're still teasing out a lot of different aspects, which I'll talk about later on, but just as a heads up. So for the US, we're looking at the American Community Survey, and we're looking at least 20 years in terms of data. So that gives us quite a rich understanding. And well, I didn't want it to be as rich as this slide, but we work with what we have here. So the way that we define or look at care infrastructure is by dividing it into care demand and care supply. So as the first thing I'll do here is kind of comment on how we're looking at care demand and supply. And then at the same time, I will also be addressing some potential questions or concerns that arise with trying to measure care infrastructure here. So in the first sense, when we look at care demand, we're looking at the potential demand. So in that context, we're including all individuals who may require assistance with their daily activities. So the reason I say that we're looking at this as potential demand, as opposed to the accurate or the overall accurate representation of demand, is because we break it down into 3 categories. First, we're looking at children aged under 18. Then we're looking at elderly individuals aged 65 and above. And thirdly, we're looking at a category for disabled people of all ages. Now, in the first 2 categories, we're not including disabled individuals. We only include those in the last category. So in our opening session, there was a mention of how not all disabled individuals would require care. Some are actually care providers. And we understand that with the type of categories we have, that we may have that kind of overlap. And we're still trying to figure out a better way of kind of arriving at these categories. So once we open up the room for discussion, if you have any comments on that, we'd be happy to take those. So because we have these three categories for care demand, we then have a corresponding category for care supply for each of those. Now, this is where it gets even trickier. Within care supply, we're essentially referring to occupations within the American Community Survey. And the way that those occupations are defined are in broader sense. For example, we have registered nurses, we have therapists, we have special education teachers. What we cannot derive from these occupations at this point is, are they providing this service for a particular age group, for a particular category, or is this just broader? So the way that it appears in the ACS for now is that it's a broad category talking about all registered nurses, not specializing in terms of are they looking at children or so on and so forth. So in that sense, we do have quite a bit of overlap when we try to arrive at child care supply, elderly care supply, and for disabled individuals supply. So like I said, there's a lot of things that needs to be teased out with measuring care. And there's a lot of research talking about how difficult it is. This just reiterates that point. So at some point, this will work. Yes. So in terms of how are we looking at this then, we're basically creating an indicator where we're looking at all the full-time equivalent workers in each of these categories that we've talked about. And the way that we interpret this indicator is that it's essentially showing you X number of full-time equivalent care workers available per 100 people who require care. So this is for each category. So we have three indicators, one for childcare, one for elderly, and one for disabled. So this just allows an insight into the range of full-time equivalent workers that we have. So the results that I'm showing you here are from the year 2022. So it's the most recent data. So let's just talk about that a little bit. So we start off with childcare, and we see that the lower bound range is roughly about 2.7 full-time equivalent childcare worker available per 100 children who would require care. And we find that to be in the state of Utah, and the upper bound goes to around 15.4 full-time equivalent care workers, which is in DC. Similarly, for elderly care, we notice that there are 3 full-time equivalent care workers, which is the lowest bound, and the upper bound increases to 23 full-time equivalent care workers, and we go from Delaware to DC in terms of low to high. For disabled care, we have roughly 7 full-time equivalent care workers to about 22 full-time equivalent care workers. So all other states are lying in between these ranges. So what I can mention here is that there are very few states that tend to be in the higher bounds, and quite a few of them that are in the lower to low middle bound. So I'm just going to summarize all of this really quickly by reiterating the importance of this project, which is that what we've just shown here is a state-by-state indicator of how many full-time equivalent care workers do we have for each 100 worker, or for each 100 individual that requires care. And it is absolutely essential to have this stepping stone to arrive at a better understanding of what is happening within each state with respect to their demographic composition, which is something that is planned out for the future, and also to address the autonomy that states have with respect to policy implications and devising policy measures when it comes to paid sick leave and other avenues that could help facilitate the provision of care. So in that context, I call this as a baby step towards a broader picture of getting to as accurate a measure of the care deficit that we can, because measuring care is complicated. So for future extensions, one thing that IWPR will try to focus on is trying to rethink or reimagine these categories. And I think at this point, that is one of the most pivotal things to do. Also, try to evaluate what is a good benchmark. So while we're saying 2.7 individuals, is that enough, or do we actually need 15 or more workers? So those are quite a lot of things to do, and we'll see how it goes from there. Thank you.
So we have Sonia's co-author in the audience today. Martha, I just wanted to ask if you wanted to add anything before we move to some questions. Come up, or you could have.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sania, for a wonderful presentation. Just a couple of points regarding the extensions or the context also of the indicator. It's an approach and an initial step, as Sania said, to kind of like measuring this demand-supply relationship. But an important thing that we want to pay attention to is how does this impact the unpaid care and the people who provide this unpaid care, right? And that will be we would need an initial benchmark to understand what is a good level of full-time equivalent worker, but then the most important benchmark is how that impacts unpaid care. And therefore relating it to, well, if we want to have a better infrastructure and if this full-time equivalent worker increases, does it decrease unpaid care and therefore release women or those unpaid care workers from the burden of this unpaid care? And that's the end goal that we have, right? How do we take that further step, and how do we engage that conversation, or how do we kind of combine that analysis to the broader care economy and the broader care conversation that we're also thinking of right now and today here. So that's
Thank you. Thank you, Martha. Okay, we have a few minutes if there are some questions or comments specifically on this presentation.
Hi, I'm Selin Seçilakın from American University. This is a very short question. Do you have any information on public investment in care infrastructure? Because I think that might also be relevant and be a possible extension.
So thank you for your question. At this point, we do not, but I do acknowledge the fact that it is an important thing to consider. And there was some discussion earlier over breakfast that maybe it might be a good idea to look at public and private expenditure. So we'll keep note of that. Thank you.
Hi, Krishana Lloyd, Child Trends. One thing I just would suggest is maybe there's some research by Bipartisan Policy Center on childcare specifically, but also choice and thinking about parental choice, which might be important to consider too, right? And sometimes, and I think what they struggle with is, are people really making choices, or is it a false choice? Like, are they backed into certain decisions that they need to make around childcare, or what the need is, or what have you? So anyway, just a suggestion that maybe thinking about that parental aspect and, what preferences are might be important too.
Thank you so much for that.
Hi, very interesting. I'm Laura from the Century Foundation. And sorry if I missed this, but I was just wondering if you have any sense of an adequacy benchmark of what level of supply would meet the demand for care that you discuss.
So as part of our extension, that's one thing that we will be aiming to look into, especially because the way that we're looking at supply and demand is each individual category. So that comes with a different context for each of those categories. You may need, say, 5 or 10 people to look after someone who's elderly, or you might need 2 or 3 to look after children. So each category would have a different composition. So that's a future extension project.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, this is Ingrid from IDV, and I was wondering if maybe you have thought on also considering the aspect of how it will be, what will be the role of physical infrastructure, and the fact that maybe like the gap could be diminished by also increasing the physical infrastructure of more schools and more places to offer care.
Yes, so absolutely. Not only does care work depend on the human side of it, there's also the need to provide physical infrastructure. One small example I could provide is a project that I was working on in Colorado, where they were looking at what is a way of increasing community support. And one of the suggestions that was put forward was to provide a community center, because there are certain ethnic and racial groups there that needed time but couldn't because they were involved in unpaid childcare. So and they couldn't outsource that, or they couldn't address that unpaid care work because there was no physical infrastructure for care work. So the idea was to allow funds to be utilized for developing a community center, which would not only provide child care support, but also provide language classes or skills training for those women who were looking after their children. So even if they wanted to invest time in childcare, they would at least be getting some benefit out of that. So if physical infrastructure definitely plays a big part in how the care supply and demand phase out.
One more? Is there anybody who hasn't spoken before? Take a second question. No? Okay, go ahead.
So my other thought was just around, there's some work that really looks, again, this is more focused on childcare, and I'm imagining this might be the same for elderly care, and I know it's the same for disabled care based on my own circumstances, but people use a mix of options, right, for childcare, and particularly for childcare, right, when we know the hours don't necessarily line up with work and what people actually need. So I'm just wondering if that's, if you considered that in that equation.
Well, at this point, we were just looking at the broader sort of, these are the total number of children, and these are, say, special education instructors or primary teachers or healthcare providers. But in terms of trying to get down into that classification, at least with the data set that we're looking at right now, that doesn't seem to be a possibility. So one other thing to consider would be, are there other sources or other data sources that we could refer to besides the American Community Survey? So this kind of, at this point, just presents like a bird's overview of what's happening with respect to care supply and care demand. But again, if we want to get into the more finer measurements of it, we kind of need to tease out measuring care economy or care infrastructure as a broad category. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on to our second speaker. Get the slides. So our second speaker will be Sarah Nolan from SEIU. This slide is, go back. There we go. Talking about better jobs, better care, building a home care infrastructure. Yeah, a little washed out, but.
Hi, everyone. Is this working? So I'm Sarah Nolan. I'm from SEIU, the Service Employees International Union. I lead our healthcare work there. And for those of you who don't know, SEIU represents a significant amount of care workers, about 800,000 home care workers, close to 200,000 nursing home workers and about 100,000 childcare workers. It's care work is at least half of our membership, and so we care a lot about the care infrastructure. And I'm not an academic, or I was in another life, but I'm not an economist. I'm actually going to talk about the efforts we've made recently with the Biden administration to address what I would say is strengthening and filling some of the gaps in the care infrastructure. It's going to be more of a practical presentation. But first, I want to define the sort of care infrastructure broadly. So in one sense, care infrastructure is the workers that create the infrastructure for providing care. But I think there's a broader sense of infrastructure that includes not just the workers themselves, but also structures and processes that support both the workers and the consumers who need care, and the workers. We often say there's, the idea that there's a workforce shortage is from the perspective of employers, from the perspective of workers, and the perspective of our members. There's a shortage of good jobs. And so what are the structures you put in place to create, to make those jobs good jobs? And I would say infrastructure in that broad sense has three components. It's a system for financing care. So we'll often you heard a lot in recent years about the waiting lists for community-based home care. But those waiting lists are really a function of state Medicaid budgets. They're not primarily a matter of workforce. It's true, if there was money, there might not be enough workers, but the waiting lists are themselves a function of state budget choices. We basically have a very fragmented system in this country for financing, or sort of non-system for financing care. The second element is a structure to support workers by ensuring they can earn a living wage, but not only that, by also offering them a chance to get training, to advance professionally. These are all things we know help with retention and recruitment of workers. But I would also say not only wages, but offering ways to offer benefits. We think the best way to do this is through a union, but it is tremendously challenging to organize this workforce, which is highly disaggregated. And then the third element is we need an infrastructure to help support families who are looking for care. I think anybody who's tried to find care for a parent, especially, knows what a crazy system it is. This is actually, these three elements, the type of infrastructure that President Biden proposed back when he was still a candidate. And I think he's probably the first presidential candidate that actually used care and infrastructure in the same sentence, and defined it kind of in this broad way. This really sort of created, so it was a lot of money to expand eligibility for paid care through Medicaid programs. It was not very well defined, but structures. The idea was increasing pay and benefits for workers and enabling them to join unions, and also creating systems to link workers and consumers. That sort of provided a blueprint, which we saw kind of fleshed out in Build Back Better, which is a sad story that I will not go into, but I think probably people are aware it didn't quite get over the finish line. But one thing that did get over the finish line was the American Rescue Plan, which was legislation that was passed to address COVID. But it created an option, this was really significant, for states to get 10%, a 10 percentage point increase in federal Medicaid reimbursement, as long as they use the funds to, quote, enhance, expand, or strengthen HCBS. And states could use the dollars for traditional infrastructure, for assistive technology, for IT, for a whole bunch of things. But what is really telling is that, first of all, this was a whole bunch of money. It was $37 billion. and at least 2/3, probably a little more, of states used it for workforce supports. They used it for bonus payments, they used it for incentive payments, they used it to create training programs, they used it to do a whole bunch of stuff to support the workforce. The other thing that's kind of notable is it was optional, and every single state in the country took it, including the reddest states, which I think is just sort of tellingly shows what the crying need to support the workforce. So that was followed by an executive order that President Biden issued almost exactly a year ago. That it included many directives on care. I'm going to mention two. The first directed CMS to improve access to home and community-based services, specifically by taking steps to support provider participation, which meant worker participation. And the word access is very key here because the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS, at that point had rulemaking underway to strengthen regulations that basically implement the Medicaid access rule, Medicaid access requirements. This is like a very key Medicaid provision that says that payment rates have to be set at a level to ensure that Medicaid enrollees have the same access that other types of consumers do. And so we made the case to the administration that if you're looking at home care, first of all, there's no other comparable payer, really. Private pay is small. Medicare doesn't cover it. So that you really needed to create sort of a system for examining home care worker wages, home care worker working conditions, and require states to go through that process as a means of showing that they're in compliance with this very key Medicaid provision. So CMS put out a proposed rule last year, which we are expecting them to finalize any day, eagerly awaiting for it. And what's very cool about it is it requires, first of all, that states have to guarantee that the Medicaid payments that are going to home care, that a minimum percentage of them, which is right now set at 80%, are actually going to worker compensation. And really equally important from my perspective anyway, is that states would have to create an ongoing process to examine the adequacy of payments. That process would have to include workers, would also include consumers, and it would this group would on a regular basis advise and consult the state on what the right level of payments is to attract enough workers, because as we know, there are huge shortages. And then the second executive order provision that has also has led to actual action from CMS is basically the EO directed CMS to issue guidance creating incentives for states to better connect home care workers and consumers, and that's obviously one of the elements of Biden's original proposal. Last December, CMS put out guidance that says to states, you can create what they're calling a registry. And it's a registry in the sense that it's like a list of names that would allow like workers and consumers to connect, but it also could do a whole bunch of other things. It could provide training programs. It could provide, it could do some of like the data collection that would help you answer some of your questions. It could provide support to consumers who like are unfamiliar with the long-term care system. So a whole bunch of stuff. We're very hopeful about it. It's optional for states, but the sort of sweetener is that you get pretty much the federal government pretty much pays for all of the activities. So you have to have, the state has to like sort of initiate creating this option. But then the feds pay for most of it, which we hope will be an incentive for states. So that was like a super fast survey of all the like good things that have been happening. I would say these are all good first steps, but there's a lot more to do, and I'm not going to pretend that like this fills the huge gap that we have. And I would say that we can't build the infrastructure that we need, whether it is the infrastructure in the narrow sense of workers or in the broader sense that I just laid out. We can't build that without a big investment of public money. I would say another constraint is we choose to fund long-term care, both home-based care and institutional care, through the Medicaid system. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem, but that choice leads to a bunch of constraints given the nature, the state federal nature of Medicaid. So that leaves it, and that probably explains some of the variability we see, but that means the states have a tremendous amount of flexibility in how they address workforce problems, how they structure their care programs, whether it's Medicaid or child care or long-term care. And so I think if we really are going to think about filling in the gaps in infrastructure and building a real infrastructure, that is sort of a conversation ultimately about budgets and state budget choices and revenue raising choices. And that is sort of my segue into the next presentation. But happy to, that was a real fast overview, so happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I should say, it's sort of obvious, but that Mike Darner is not here, so we do have a few extra minutes. So I think we could take maybe 3-4 minutes if there are questions or comments for Sarah. Okay, Ariane.
Hi, I'm Ariane Higovish from the Institute for Women's Policy Research. In a way, this takes up the speaker from the morning, Tiffany Boyman from the Women's Bureau, and they did a lot with federal money to try to incentivize states to innovate. And I'm just, Sarah, your talk is very cautious, right? It's optimistic, but also we know these states kind of. So are there how are they trying to make sure that states actually do the right things? Is it about learning, competition, not stopping them from opting out, whatever, all those things?
Is this on? Yeah. So how are they? If they is CMS, I don't think CMS actually really ever tries to do stuff. The way I see it, and this is, before I did sort of long-term care stuff, I wrote a lot of the Massachusetts law that was the basis for the ACA. And so my observation about Medicaid, and my presentation was really confined to Medicaid-funded home care because that's what our members provide, but also that's the biggest payer. I think when it comes to Medicaid, you have this copycat effect. You had that with states doing big waivers to cover more populations, to cover more kids in the 80s and 90s. And so I think I'm sort of hopeful there will be a little bit of a copycat effect. And I that was part of my point about every state taking up the ARPA money. We haven't seen that in the Medicaid expansion space, right? And so there's that. But to give a little bit of credit to CMS, what they're doing is where they can actually require something is taking what they call a sort of best practices approach. And so the guidance I mentioned that they put out on registries is basically they say to states, you don't have to do this. You don't even have to do all the activities that we're laying out in this guidance, but here's what we think
a good, robust registry would look like, and we're here to help you do that. And they've done a bunch of like learning collaboratives lately with states that I think promote the sort of cross, imitation, basically, I would call it.
Thank you. Okay, we can have one more, and then we'll move on.
Julie Cashin with the Century Foundation. Hi, Sarah. Wanted to just follow up on that question because I think one of the things that is interesting about this is the way organizing may play a role in what Ariana is getting at. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how organizers could come together with policymakers or policy experts to move kind of states in the right direction or hold them accountable.
So I'll do that by way of one example, which is that's happening right now in Michigan. So Michigan is a place where home care workers used to be organized, and then there was a Republican governor, and that sort of all went away. And we're now reorganizing them and recreating a state authority that will act as the employer, which is one of the issues with home care workers. I mentioned it's hard to organize them because they're disaggregated, but in a lot of models, a lot of Medicaid models, and then obviously in the gray market, there's no one common employer to bargain with, right? So our solution in the past, when we've organized workers, has been to create an entity that acts as the employer of those workers in that state. So the great thing is Michigan is sort of creating this model, but they are specifically, and Governor Whitmer put in her budget, a registry with the and they were able to go sell it to the legislature by saying this isn't going to cost a lot of money because like here we have this guidance. So that's one example.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to our last presentation. If we could get the slides, please. Okay, so we have John Whitten from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy speaking to us about revenue to fund care, very important, infrastructure.
Thank you. Is that all right? Everybody can hear me okay? Great. It's nice to be here this afternoon. Like she just said, I'm John Whitten. I'm the Deputy Director at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and we focus only on tax policy. We don't really focus on the spending side of things. But we know, like a lot of you in this room, that spending on care and other public investments is critically important. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways we can do that at the federal level, the state level, and a little bit at the local level. Let's see. So this is us, like when we're in budget fights. Way too much. If you're in the back of the room or you're online, you might not even really be able to tell. We are fighting for that tiny slice of this tiny pie. And this is a terrible situation. I've lived through it. It ends up pitting advocates for one worthy cause against another. And it's a zero-sum kind of mentality that nobody, advocates for anything, you're not leaving this kind of thing satisfied. Nobody's happy. So really, we need a mindset shift. We need to grow this pie. That's a much more delicious looking pie, too, I think. We need to shift from this mindset of scarcity around finances to one of abundance. And that sounds great. It's great for like an activist or whatever. Obviously, this is politically super hard. But I think there's two things we have in our favor as we try to do this. One is that the people are largely with us. Polling for years and years shows kind of two distinct things. One, people like the public services they receive, and they don't want to lose them. And a lot of times they want new public services, right? And they're also incredibly supportive of new revenues, particularly new revenues on the wealthiest individuals and profitable corporations. And the second thing we have going in our favor is there's a lot of policy options to raise more revenue at all levels of government. And that's what I'm going to go a little more in depth about. I'm not going to go super wonky in depth because we don't have the time for that, but you can always find more stuff on our website for all the details. So I'm going to start at the federal level. And it's kind of a bad news, good news setup here. So at the federal level, really for the last many decades, it's been mostly a tax cutting kind of environment. And again, mostly centered on people at the top and profitable corporations. The corporate tax rate has been cut. The top income tax rate has been cut. The estate tax on inheritances has been sort of turned into a shell of its former self, and the federal government has lost a lot of revenue as a result. Everybody is so concerned about the deficit. We weren't really running these kind of deficits 20 years ago. We had enough revenue to do what we needed to do. And the tax cuts have really made it, constricted the entire environment. However, maybe there's good news. Okay. I thought my slide for good news had been taken out. I thought that was some sort of bad omen. The good news is there are things we can do, and right now I think politically the tide has been turning in recent years. The president we have today is probably the best president on tax fairness, at least since I've been alive. I'm 44, and possibly like in 2 lifetimes of mine. And he's not the only one. Other leading politicians are kind of putting tax fairness and the need to raise revenue and fund critical public investments at the center of their policy agenda, and they're talking about it all the time. So there's a lot of different kind of proposals that are out there at the federal level, from Congress, from the administration. I think really the best place to start is Biden's own budget. So he released his budget last month, and it is like it has for the past few years. It's like chock full of great revenue raising options. I think all told, the revenue package in there would raise more than $5 trillion over 10 years. And there's big ticket stuff, there's small item stuff in there. There's corporate, there's individual, there's taxing wealth. And it all is sort of centered at the top end of things. And it includes, plenty of things on the low income scale too, like low income credits and whatnot as well. So that's, I think, where we should be sort of focusing as advocates at the federal level. The stuff that is already out there, stuff the president is proposing, restoring the corporate tax rate, if not to what it was before President Trump, then close to it. Figuring out ways to better tax wealth. There's a lot of different proposals on unrealized capital gains that are out there, as well as sort of more fairly taxing realized capital gains, which are in most cases taxed less than regular wage income at the federal level. So that's a very top line look at the federal level. State level, there's three sort of contextual elements I want to touch on at the state level. The first is that unlike the federal level, states have to balance their budgets, usually every year. And this creates, this constrains that pie. It makes the pie harder, but it also does come with some opportunities, particularly when there are economic downturns. Nobody wants to see an economic downturn, but when states start to run out of revenue, nobody wants to make program cuts, So those can be opportunities to actually flip things around and raise a fair amount of revenue going forward. The second piece of context is that since the 1990s, we've seen a number of waves of deep tax cuts at the state level. We are hopefully coming out of a wave of that from the last few years right now, which was unfortunately sort of spurred by the ARPA money and states deciding not to necessarily spend that on things like care infrastructure, but instead to spend it on tax cuts. But that is dwindling up, and I'm hoping that the tax cutting mania we've seen in the past few years at the state level will also subside. The last piece of context is less on the revenue and the pie and more on what it looks like inside that pie. And that's, the federal tax system is modestly progressive. So people who make the most pay the most. State tax systems are the opposite, total opposite. They're completely upside down and regressive in nearly every state. Our study, Who Pays, goes into super much detail on this. If you haven't ever seen it before, I encourage you to check it out at whopays.org. A couple of the top things from that report worth noting. 41 states tax the top 1% less than any other income group in that state. And in 44 states, the tax code actually exacerbates income inequality. So it takes income, the tax code then redistributes it, sorry, it's Friday, upward, right, in this sort of reverse Robin Hood effect. And all of this has an impact on revenue as well. So at the state level, the cop-out answer of what we can do to raise revenue is, depends on the state. But I could walk away after saying that, but that would be really unfair. There are a lot of proposals that we are advocating for in a range of states. I've kind of grouped them here into red state stuff, blue state stuff, but your mileage may vary. The most important thing in red states is preventing more cuts. Every time we see sort of a battle to protect an income tax or protect a corporate tax at the state level, when our allies and partners can win those fights, that's just as important as raising new revenue. It's protecting what we have and preventing things from getting worse, and it's just vitally important. It often gets overlooked in revenue conversations, so I just wanted to lift that up. But it doesn't have to be all defense all the time either in red states. One thing I want to highlight is there is, often a strong appetite around closing corporate tax loopholes for multi-state and multinational corporations. This can have broader bipartisan support at the state level because it often gets local business organizations and leaders to weigh in positively because they are leveling the tax playing field between them and sort of the big guys. Now on the blue state side, you'll see it kind of looks the same, right? You still have to prevent further cuts because we can't pretend like blue states don't love to cut taxes too. So you got to keep what you have, but then there's more options, and we're seeing a lot more sort of innovation in some of these states these days. Certainly, you can turn to higher top marginal rates on income. That's tried and true way to raise a lot of revenue. An increasing number of states are interested in taxing wealth, just like folks at the federal level are. This is kind of still a little bit uncharted territory, but there's a lot of interest from lawmakers in a good handful, about a dozen or less states. So I expect that this will be really an area where we see a lot of expansion in the coming years. And the last one that I'll mention is mansion taxes, which is really it's making the real estate transfer tax progressive. So in most places, well, there's 17 cities or counties that have these taxes, mansion tax, but in most places it's just a flat tax, which is regressive. Hi, come on in. So, the local mansion tax, basically, if you sell your house for over some set amount of money, you will pay a higher transfer tax rate than people who sell it at a lower rate. And again, like I said, that's mostly at the local level now, but I see that also kind of creeping into the state level conversations. I want to wrap up with just two state examples, and I'm going to need to really check my notes here because I will probably get things wrong. Like I said, we focus mostly on the tax side and not the spending side. So if I misstate anything about these two states, you can tell me. I want to start, though, with New Mexico. So for more than a decade, advocates there were trying to fix two big problems in New Mexico. First, the state just constantly had dismal rankings on every child well-being index. Big problem. Second, they had a regressive tax code that asked the most of those with the least and the least of those with the most. In 2019 and 2020, New Mexico made a lot of progress towards starting to fix some of those problems. They passed a big tax reform package that raised rates on high-income individuals, expanded low-income credits, and raised a whole lot of revenue in the process to fund critical priorities. And then they also created the Early Childhood Trust Fund in 2020. This was initially funded from general fund revenues, but the ongoing funding mechanism for that is from oil and gas extraction, which is like a special dedicated fund in New Mexico and other kind of states with a lot of oil and gas extraction. 2 years later, in 2022, New Mexico sort of won again in this area by voters approved the dedicated permanent fund for childcare investments, right? And so this fund is expected to get a few $100 million a year, is my understanding, and that's going to fund a range of care investments, everything from pre-K access to reimbursement rates for providers. I was involved in New Mexico before the first tax reform package was passed, like pretty heavily with advocates there. And when I reconnected with one recently, as I was preparing for this, she really suggested that we have to think about all of that stuff holistically. Like the tax reform package might not seem super connected to the care fund, but it really created the comfort with having more general fund revenue created more comfort for lawmakers and the public to take more money from those special funds to then fund care. And also, like we go back to the pie, right? Having more general fund revenue means you can spend more money on good things. So that is what happened there as well. Moving across the country to Massachusetts, there it's a little less care specific, but I think it's an instructive tax story too. In 2022, after a long time coming, voters approved a surtax on income over $1 million. It's called the Fair Share Amendment. I'm sure Sarah is very familiar with this from her work in Massachusetts for a long time. The surtax was a way of getting around the fact that that state's income tax is flat. So we see a lot of flat income taxes in the states, and advocates have to figure out creative ways to raise more revenue from wealthy people if they can't make a graduated rate. This new tax has raised hundreds of millions of dollars already for transportation and education, which is what it's earmarked for. The education funding includes a whole lot of stuff for early ed and care. Couple examples that have come through recently that have already been funded is free school lunch for every K-12 student throughout the state. And then a big investment in a care fund, not a big investment, like $25 million, I think was the number, in a care fund that is going to increase reimbursement rates and reduce wait times for spots. Let's see. I have maybe a final thing. Yeah, that's all. Sorry, this was like super fast, covered a lot of ground, federal, state. I encourage you to check out all of the stuff on our website for more detailed information, like on the Biden budget or on state budgets or anything. And I'm happy to answer any questions now or later. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so now we'd like to take 3 or 4 minutes for questions on John's presentation, and then we will open it up for general discussion and questions and comments. Yes.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. When people were talking about accounting earlier and all the money stuff, I've done budgeting and childcare, so it's very interesting to me. My name's Anya, and I wanted to ask what you think the viability is of really putting the estate tax policy ideas just towards care, like looking at it as just segmenting us out of everything else, maybe? I don't know. I'm just curious your just general thoughts on the viability, and if any of you never saw when Catherine Edwards, who's an economist, spoke to one of the senators about this idea. It was just a really powerful message just about the value of care, and so I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thank you. I think, it's a good idea. I mean, I am usually against sort of dedicated funding. I think it cuts both ways. Having dedicated revenue for a new, dedicated spending side things for a new piece of revenue, everybody wants that. Advocates for everything want that, which makes it hard to get in there if that's your spending priority. But it can help with popular opinion. And, you see, especially when revenue referendum go to the polls, when it's like a ballot measure, the things that win more often, and this is more at the state and local level, are things that are tied to specific investments. Because then people can really connect it in a way that they can't when they're just like, I don't know, where's this going to go? So I don't know. That's about all I can really say. It could be a viable option. I would expect it would be challenging to like really get the whole thing, but go for it.
Thanks. Another question or comment? In the back, maybe? Yeah.
So this might be a comment and question, but I think part of what's been really hard with Biden's budget is seeing the cuts on all things healthcare gradually each year after year, which loops directly into the conversation of care and its impact all around on specifically disproportionately impacted communities. So while there's solutions, and I see, your comment on him being one of the most progressive, at the same time, it's such a struggle to see those specific cuts at play gradually, especially when the recurrent issue is all things healthcare spending and non-defense spending in Congress.
Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Daniela Ochoa Diaz.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, right? I mean, I definitely, again, I'm not as focused on the spending side of things and that side of the ledger. I do think, Biden has been very strong on taxes and on new revenue, but the federal budget process is not a pretty place to be, right? Yeah, it's a painful thing. And I think it can feel often like no matter what, we're losing. But I also, if that was the case, then why are we here? And, we might as well just go run and hide in the corner or something. So I do want to try to always think that we can at least improve, even if it ends up being sort of around the edges.
Response to that comment. I'm putting on my rose-colored glasses. One more for John before we move on to open discussion. Ariane, did you have a?
Thank you. It's Ariane Higovish again. Mine, maybe bridges two issues. So you said in Michigan, not in Michigan, in New Mexico and Massachusetts, both there was advocacy, which then led to change. And so what was the messaging that brought this about? And to link this also, Vicky Szabo is sitting behind me thinking about paid family leave, how coalitions were built. So what were the themes? What were the coalitions? What pushed it over the top?
I will let Sarah talk about the Massachusetts side on that, but certainly in New Mexico and what we've seen in other states is the revenue coalition. Every state has some sort of revenue coalition. It's usually headed by the fiscal shop that is the state level think tank. I used to work at one in New Jersey. You've got to broaden that group, right? You just got to keep broadening that group. You have to keep that group disciplined. If I'm just talking about tax right now, you have to keep that group disciplined on, we need more revenue basically for everything, right? And the care advocates at the table can then kind of take that message to their people and go back and say, we need this for care. The enviros can go and say, we need it for the environment. But when you're sitting at a table with a lawmaker all together, it's really powerful to see all of those people all saying we need more revenue. So I think that that's really been a big change at the state level in terms of the public message. I also think that just the acknowledgement of the fact that the tax code is so upside down. I'm not just trying to toot our own horn about this data on who pays and that, but like we do hear from state advocates that is like a real difference maker in a lot of the campaigns at the state level.
I can add in on the history of Massachusetts. And so actually I am a former academic and a classicist. And so I tend to look at the long durée of history. And the Massachusetts created a flat tax in the Constitution in the 1800s, and it has been on the ballot 4 times in the last 100 years and failed miserably the last time in 1994 when I worked on it, and I still have PTSD from it. And so the going to the sort of tax which is not a graduated tax, it's just a tax on very high income, was a way to deal with the failure to ever, with the likelihood that they were never going to adopt what I would argue would be a much more fair tax system. But even, and again, speaking historically, the attempt, that sort of success in 22 was a long time coming. I mean, this very or similar proposal was sort of circulating 10 years ago when I was still doing state budget work in Massachusetts. And why transportation and education, I think those were clearly crying needs. Has to do with the way education is funded in Massachusetts. I would also say has to do, Medicaid's mandatory, right? And I mean, obviously states make choices about how much or little they do, but it tends to get funded and be a little less volatile. And I would also say Mike Dukakis loves transportation.
Okay, thank you. So now I'd like to open it up to general questions or comments for any of the speakers or on the topic more generally or widely. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Laura from the Century Foundation. So one of the things that you mentioned around building a bigger pie was wealth taxes. And as we know, there is a significant gender and racial wealth gap. And I was just hoping you could talk a little bit about how you see wealth taxes in relationship to like how they might impact gender and racial wealth gaps, especially considering that those gaps emerge in large part due to care responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, it would help tremendously to close both. It's the amount of wealth in this country that flows to white men. I'm saying this as a white man. It's astounding, and anything we can do to better tax those gains that just kind of can go on in perpetuity and oftentimes can be handed down from generation to generation without being taxed is going to certainly reduce the racial wealth gap, the gender wealth gap, and hopefully put people on a more solid footing moving forward.
Thank you. Heidi, you had a question.
I just wanted to say that I really appreciated this session because it has a very practical approach. I love the big picture sessions we also had. I love your presentation in particular. But it's nice to get, something practical. So I like the fact when Sania, you said, well, this is what the data set has. This is what we're going to use to make these indicators. Duh, yeah, that's what policy work is. You work with what you got. And Sarah, I feel like if you could turn those slides into a manual, into a guide of here's what you can do with Medicaid in all the different ways, that would just be fantastic. People would really love that. And then also, John, your work on what we can do to increase taxes. And I forget what other points you made, but there's just so many policy options there. So I was just glad to see, some focus on practical policy. So I just appreciate your panel. Thank you very much.
And things that can be done, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, another comment or question? Yes.
Hi, it's Ingrid again. Just a small comment, and is that the conversation focused on your presentation, John, about increasing tax. But I thought, how could it be the approach of also creating incentives by reducing tax to like care providers and also like to companies that offer benefits to care providers, like yes, in general, like creating incentives by to the private sector to also provide care.
Sorry, I was like having a choking fit while you were asking your question, which is what I get for trying to drink a little sip of water. Yeah, I think you can, I think we can make the tax code more fair on both ends, right? We can use it to raise revenue to fund things directly. We can also use it to incentivize positive social outcomes, right? I think a good example at the federal level is last year's or 2022's Inflation Reduction Act, right? It raised a bunch of revenue to fund things directly, but it also included a lot of tax credits, around environmental things and that nature. So I think that's a good model to use at the state level and even at the federal level for care.
Yeah, I would. I'm a grump about. I used to work on tax policy. I think we should just tax everybody and then use the money in a good way. I mean, I get that it makes it easier to pass, and I'm not totally against doing policy through the tax code. We do it. I don't think it's always wrong. I think when you do it, you have to think about how you structure it so that it's still progressive. So you could give families. I mean. I am not against the idea, for example, this is one proposal that's been out there, of giving tax credits to family care providers, but I think you have to figure out how you do it in a way that's not actually rewarding sort of high income, high wealth families. And, we can do it. We've done it with the child care tax credit. But I have to say that. So.
I second that emotion, as they would say.
Hi, I'm Amy Matsui, Director of Income Security at the National Women's Law Center. And I just wanted to chime in on that because I couldn't stop myself. So I think one thing that we have seen from tax credits that are directed towards employers, both for childcare and for paid leave, is that for a variety of reasons, including that, large corporations often don't have a lot of tax liability, there's kind of a limit to what you can incentivize in terms of behavior with tax credits. So are you rewarding kind of companies that are going to be doing this and can afford to do that for white collar employees anyway? Or are you actually kind of creating more supply that can be scaled up? And I think that the jury, the most generous description on the federal level is that the jury is out, but in fact, it's been really underclaimed. So in these two specific cases, at least tax credits for employers for childcare and for paid leave, they haven't really worked, but there's a continual allure to those. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Hi, Vicky Shabo from New America. Since I got invoked before and I wanted to piggyback on that, I was just going to say, I feel like I'm really glad to have a revenue conversation here because I feel like for so long, our substantive conversations about the kinds of policies that we want to pass have been devoid of conversations about revenue. I also feel like there's this constant tension about minimizing the cost, sort of talking about you can get a lot for a little, and sort of I feel like that undermines our ability to say, actually, we need big investments because we have big problems and there's a big unmet need. And so just thinking about how we lean into messaging about the fact that, for example, a comprehensive national paid leave program could cost $600 billion over 10 years. And that's okay because we actually have more than 100 million people that don't have paid family leave in this country. Similarly for childcare and for the work that Julie and others have done here. And then the last thing that I was really struck by is sort of this description of groups sitting around revenue tables with different priorities, but talking to lawmakers about the need to raise revenue. And I feel like that is super, super important and hasn't been done that much, but also isn't enough. And that comes down to political power And once you have agreement that you need to raise revenue, how that revenue gets allocated. And I think we saw the limits in Build Back Better of sort of where the money went and where it didn't go. And then the last connection I'll make is to the wage gap point, which is part of the problem with women and women of color earning less as it diminishes their political power because we have such a rigged system in terms of financing. So I feel like all of these things fit together in really troubling ways. And I just kind of wanted to name all those things, but also particularly for folks who've been active at the state level, sort of how have you seen that play out and seen CARE win? And I think we've heard some of that, but if there's just anything else to say.
I don't have an answer to that last question, but I will say on your point about sort of limits of like everyone sitting around the table and pushing for something, you're totally right. I mean, that group has to stay together all the whole time, right? Like you can't just come together. It has to be a permanent sort of piece of the progressive infrastructure in a state or whatever, because there has to be accountability. And that's one of the most important pieces of tax campaign work, certainly at the state level, which I'm more familiar with, because it might not match up to the spending they said they were going to do, and often they just turn around and will do the opposite thing and then go and cut taxes, a year later if it becomes an election year or whatever. So I think I'm glad you raised that point, and I just wanted to echo that.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I don't have a perfect answer either, but I mean, and I'm going to unsurprisingly invoke unions again, but where we have organized home care workers in Washington, in California, in Oregon, in Illinois, in Massachusetts, I think you can point to substantial progress on, and the very fact of the organizing and of the existence of a union gives those workers who I agree are disenfranchised politically a chance to come together. I mean, frankly, during the ACA battle, some of the best lobbying was done by our home care members, right? And so in many of those states where we have organized home care workers and created this authority-like structure, there has not only been an increase in access to training, but there's been a force to fight for increases in state funding. So I don't tell my bosses. There's probably other ways to do it, but a union is a very good way to do it.
So I kind of wanted to add just one point from this morning, coming back to this point about accounting. I feel like, so when we're sitting at the table and talking about revenue and how much revenue we need and how this is really expensive, but we need the revenue, the talking about the invisibilized, externalized costs, right, that we talked about this morning, they get pushed off into unpaid care, by women where it's invisible. If the more we can make those costs visible, the better positioned we are to make this argument about these revenues, right? That these costs aren't new. We're not suddenly creating them, right? We're talking about addressing them in a more humane and actually productive and so on way, right? So I think that those two parts kind of go together.
And I just wanted to add one more bit on the same idea, right? It does us no service as advocates to try to undercut what something costs, because we're not going to get what we're asking for, like, ever. So it should be the big number. We shouldn't be like, oh, we can really fudge this and we'll only ask for $400 million. If you need $1 billion, you need $1 billion, and ask for it. You're probably not going to get it. So we don't want to end up in a place where we're getting $200 million because we asked for $400 million. We'd much rather be getting $600 million out of the billion we asked for.
Right. Well, while we're arguing that it's actually worth 1.5 million, right? So, or whatever it was, how many zeros you had, I don't remember, but okay. I think we're out of time. So thank you so much.
Just add one thing, because I want to bring it back to Sonia's. I was totally psyched by her presentation. I think it needs to be data driven, and that's why I'm so excited about what you put out. Because I'll say throughout Build Back Better, I was constantly getting how many jobs is this going to create? How many people is it going to serve? And I made it up all the time, and it was intellectually honest making it up, but you do have to start from somewhere. And I think the fact that we don't have some of this data just shows how this work has been so much in the shadows. And so I think I'm like super excited by what you're doing, and just wanted to bring it back to the beginning.
Thank you, Sarah. Great. Okay, so the closing plenary will be in this room. So I'm going to welcome you back here at some time, which maybe I should mention. So at 3:20. Thank you.